as we see it introduced by Mr. Trump. Isolationism, some kind of doubts about NATO, comments on Russia, Putin, some fascination with them. But what do you think, what is the responsibility of the Republican Party, for this underestimation and for this way how it's currently the U.S. foreign policy is seen?
We have to admit that Trump hijacked the Republican primary process. He's not a Republican, but he was a more effective candidate than any of the established Republican politicians. And I think it's fair to say that he deserved to win the nomination because he simply campaigned more effectively than Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio, or Ted Cruz. Unfortunately, Mr. Trump is a very inexperienced man when it comes to foreign policy and indeed to politics generally. And over the last year, he's said a whole series of things that anybody who thinks seriously about the international scene regards with dismay. The only hope we can have is that if he wins, he will appoint people to positions such as Secretary of State and National Security Advisor who have the experience that he lacks. And we must hope that will happen, because the thought of Donald Trump making up foreign policy on his own is frankly terrifying, especially from the point of view of Ukraine.
But the hope, is it something you rely on? Is it just that?
Well, I don't think it's just hope, because in practice, if Donald Trump wins, his first task will be to build an administration. And you can't build an administration with your children. You have to appoint people with experience. And I've no doubt that his first calls, if he is elected, will be to the kind of people who could take the job of Secretary of State, Defense Secretary, National Security Advisor, and do those jobs well. In the end, he doesn't have much choice. You can't run the biggest and most powerful government in the world with a bunch of your real estate buddies and kids. So ultimately, the grown-ups, the experienced people, will end up taking jobs in a Trump administration, and inevitably they will be able to check some of the president's more inexperienced impulses.
So is then the Hillary Clinton a lesser evil? For you, somebody who is also very critical to the Obama administration.
I think from the vantage point of foreign policy, she is the lesser evil. It's a little harder to say that she's the lesser evil from the point of view of domestic politics.
Why?
Well, I spent some time in the last couple of weeks looking closely at her policy proposals, and I must say that I can't feel at all enthusiastic about them. And ultimately, we have to remember that the number one priority of the American president is the United States, and in particular, getting the US economy back on track. From that vantage point, I'm not sure that Hilary Clinton is the lesser evil. But in foreign policy, there's no question. She has the experience. He doesn't. She has a good understanding of the challenges that Ukraine faces. He doesn't. She has good experience of dealing as Secretary of State with Russia as well as with China, and he doesn't. So from a foreign policy point of view, the world has to hope that Hilary Clinton is the next president.
But these are the American voters who vote in the end. But so do you feel, and we can't see the coherent economic policy of Mr. Trump, because there are a lot of things when, there are things where people get frightened, but what are the solutions he proposed? That's not really at all not obvious, the realistic solution.
Well, Hillary Clinton proposes a vast increase in expenditure on infrastructure and other programs financed mostly with tax increases. And it's hard for me to believe that that is the right way to go. Trump made a speech at the Economic Club of New York just the other day in which he argued for tax reform, simplification. These are ideas that I like. Deregulation, an idea that I strongly support. And it's clear that Trump would be offering much more stimulus than Clinton, because he would be cutting taxes rather than raising them. Now, there are all kinds of problems with Trump's economic policies on trade, on immigration, on offshoring, on overseas investment. I have all kinds of reservations about some of the issues that Trump has addressed over the last year. But when I looked at his economic speech the other day, I have to say it made a lot more sense than Hillary Clinton's. But that's not to say that I'd rather see Trump as president. I think there are far too many question marks over his character, over his experience, over his knowledge of foreign policy for me to feel comfortable with a Trump presidency. I just hope, and I want to stress that once again I am hoping, that if Hilary Clinton is president, because she'll be dealing with a Republican House, possibly also with a Republican Senate, she will tone down some of the more Bernie Sanders elements of her economic policy.
If we look now, Donald Trump and some of the Republicans today play with the card of anti-establishment. And it's picked up, but you know, when you talk to Newt Gingrich, who's been a speaker, who devised big companies, you know, like, it's not anti-establishment. How do you think it works? Why this, you explain this kind of picking up of the anti-establishment mood by the people who doesn't look like somebody who are a bit outside of us?
Well, everybody is beating up on the establishment these days. I can understand why voters regard the political class with suspicion. We've been through quite a roller coaster over the last 20 years. Whether you look at foreign policy or economic policy, we've seen wars that have not ended well. We saw a massive financial crisis. And I think ordinary voters have come to the conclusion that there is an unhealthy relationship between Washington and Wall Street. Congress has approval ratings in the single digits. There's deep distrust of professional politicians. And of course, Hilary Clinton personifies the political class. She has been around in American politics since her husband became president. She's been a senator, Secretary of State. By contrast, Donald Trump is not a professional politician, that's for sure. Of course, he's part of the financial establishment as a very wealthy New York real estate guy, and he's part of the media establishment as a reality TV star. So you might say, what kind of an anti-establishment candidate is he really? But I think compared with her, he is. Compared with Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump is an outsider. And you can tell he's an outsider by the way he talks, because there isn't a week that goes past without Donald Trump saying something that is politically incorrect. Oddly enough, that is a part of his appeal to an electorate that is sick and tired of politicians with their talking points and their carefully scripted remarks. They adore the fact that Trump goes off message, that Trump is unplugged and unfiltered and says things that other politicians would never dream of saying.
Aren't you concerned that it would the divide would be stronger in the American society? The society would be more polarized if Mr. Trump wins, and it would goes down further and further. Even like today we hear the tone of the debate. That's something which we didn't really expect could happen, from the words which I used, from, you know, something which couldn't be possible a couple of years ago.
Well, people love saying the United States is a deeply polarized society, but as I pointed out at this conference yesterday, compared with 1968, the United States is not really that polarized at all, and the level of political conflict is, I think, markedly lower than it was in the late 1960s, or for that matter in the late 1940s, in the era of McCarthy. So let's not get carried away here. Whoever wins on November the 8th, there will be political divisions in the United States. It's a two-party system, although it must be said that the smaller parties are doing surprisingly well at this point. But in a two-party system, you're bound to have political polarization. To me, the most striking thing about this election is the extent to which a familiar part of the landscape, the conservatives with their strong evangelical base, have been marginalized by the Trump phenomenon. You know, it can't really be that polarized a system when the Republican candidate can be somebody who in the past has not been a Republican at all, whose wedding the Clintons attended. That doesn't suggest to me a highly polarized society.
So, my final. What are the things to watch out during this upcoming month? What are the things to point out? Because there are, of course, smaller things which are important, like Hillary Clinton, privacy, and maybe transparency, the things which Donald Trump says, you know, like all these words. They are in the media. But what are really the decisive things, besides the debates, to watch out which may matter?
Well, I think
What it's all about. I mean, I covered both. You know, there was the economy, then there was something else. In this case, what are we following?
Well, most people expect this election to be decided by the debates or by things the candidates say intentionally or unintentionally. I'm not sure that's right. I think this election could be decided by an event that none of us foresees at the moment, say a terrorist attack. I would be very surprised if between now and November the 8th nothing happened that was outside the control of the candidates. A major terrorist attack in the United States would unquestionably tilt this race in Donald Trump's favor. And I think there are many people in the world who have reason to want a Trump presidency, who must be tempted to encourage an event like that to tilt the balance. So I think the big worry is not what Donald Trump says, not what Hilary Clinton says, but what could happen, as it were, outside the political process to decide this election.
Still one thing to ask, in this part of the world, what people are pretty surprised that, you know, this kind of, let's say, complementary tone or some things playing with Vladimir Putin for Donald Trump is not that much condemned in the U.S. society, as you know, Putin is clearly a dictator. U.S. is not Germany with Putin versteiners and things like that. And people are puzzled. How happened that the American public and the Republicans are not so strong to say like, oh, that's unacceptable, to kind of compliment the Russian dictator?
Well, of course, it's a well-known fact that the average American takes relatively little interest in the rest of the world, and people have, I think, to a large extent, lost sight of the threat that President Putin poses, and I think that's largely because of the way in which President Obama has dealt with Putin. Part of what we're seeing here, I think, is a reaction to Obama's style. Obama is not somebody who is hawkish. As a president, his response to the annexation of Crimea was to impose sanctions, not to take military action over Syria. He didn't intervene until he was absolutely forced to. And I think as Americans have grown disenchanted with Obama, they've been steadily more sympathetic to tougher foreign leaders, because that's what they feel that they lack. I think that's the explanation for the relatively sympathetic view of Putin and the tendency of many voters to forgive Donald Trump for having a bromance, which is probably the right word, with the Russian leader.